USCHO.com. This is the USCHO Game of the Week podcast from US College Hockey Online at USCHO.com. An in-depth look at this week's top college hockey matchup and a preview of the other big games.
Welcome to the USCHO Game of the Week podcast for Thursday, March 18th, 2021. I'm Ed Trefzger alongside Jim Connelly, and we're joined as our guest, USCHO editor emeritus and also beat writer for the Wisconsin Badgers for the Wisconsin State Journal, Todd Milewski. Gentlemen, thanks for taking the time to talk about games coming up this weekend. We might as well dive right in. Things get underway tonight, Thursday night, as Colgate visits St. Lawrence in the only semifinal game in ECAC hockey.
I think it's kind of crazy to think about the fact that there's only 3 teams even playing in this tournament. But, Todd, when I look at the ECAC and the fact that Quinnipiac didn't run away with the league but played pretty well, the one hiccup I see is the fact that they did lose to Colgate in the final regular season game by a single goal. Imagine if Colgate gets through St. Lawrence tonight and is sitting there, pretty well below 500 heading to Hamden on Saturday. I mean, if you're Quinnipiac, doesn't that give you a little pause maybe?
I think it has to, because the chaos theories are going to go wild at this point if we end up with Quinnipiac not getting through their championship game, and who do you take 2 of 3 teams that are left in the ECAC for the tournament? I mean, we love chaos on this weekend every weekend, or every year, but this is going to get a little ridiculous with some of the possibilities, and not knowing for sure what the committee is going to end up doing. That's such a wild card for, we think we have ideas, but in reality, it's going to come down to those people on their Zoom call or whatever it is that they do to figure things out at the end. Yeah, this is going to be a little wacky over the next few days.
I don't want to take anything away from St. Lawrence either. I mean, listen, they have had a great season. They could go to Hamden on Saturday if they win tonight. I mean, the reality is as much as everybody figures Quinnipiac is such a prohibitive favorite, this is now down to one and done, and Quinnipiac only playing one playoff game after having some time off. You just never know what's going to come out of a series like this.
That's exactly right. And the other thing that you can't discount this season is that we've seen so many games at the last minute get canceled, get put off because there's a positive COVID. And I mean, knock on whatever you want to knock on, that doesn't happen in these next couple of weeks, first with the conference finals and then into the NCAA tournament. But I mean, you can't count on anything happening that you think is going to happen, because it all can get upended really fast. But yeah, I mean, St. Lawrence has as good a shot. I mean, when you're going down to 1 and 2 games, I mean, yeah, they have a really good shot at winning 2 games to get into the tournament, which is just, at some level mind-boggling. But that's where we're at today with this season, I guess.
Quinnipiac does have 20% of the Hobey Baker finalists in goaltender Keith Petrozelli and the terrific Odin Tufto.
Yeah, and that's something that has been deservedly recognized, I think. I mean, the seasons that those guys have had, even when it's been in a highly modified schedule where you're playing so many teams, some of the same teams so many times, you see individual excellence like that, and those guys definitely deserve to be recognized in that. Tufto, I mean, the number of assists he has had and just the way he's been getting it done. I mean, that's one of the best performances of the season, no doubt.
So right now we figure that Quinnipiac is in no matter what, but you could see an upset that would get 2 out of 3 teams in from ECAC hockey, which could bounce some other teams along the way. Is Quinnipiac the heavy favorite here, or are we feeling like there could be a little bit of an upset?
I feel like they should be, right, Todd? I mean, this team played very well. Have they had moments that, maybe weren't as strong as they want? Sure, but every team has. I think that Ram Pecknell knows how to get his teams ready for postseason play.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there's no secrets with any of these teams that are, whether it becomes Colgate or St. Lawrence that faces Quinnipiac. I mean, they all know each other really well this season. So I do feel like that familiarity is going to help Quinnipiac. I mean, they're not going to be, blindsided by anything getting into a championship game. So I would say, yeah, pretty high favorite, but you get into a 1-game shot. If a goalie has a really good game, you never know. And that's what some of the magic of this time of the year. You can always have someone that goes on just an incredible run to get you into the NCAAs.
Atlantic Hockey gets things underway this weekend with semifinal games on Friday. Top-ranked AIC, number 15 in the USCHO.com men's Division I ice hockey poll, will host Niagara, the lower seed from the Western Pod. Niagara comes into this after upsetting Robert Morris in Pittsburgh. Chad Veltri, who's been a terrific goaltender for Niagara down the stretch, lost a shutout with just 9 seconds left with the extra attacker in the Sunday rubber match. And then the other half of it, number 19 Army hosting Canisius. I think the thing that's interesting about this series or these pair of playoff games is that the impact of Atlantic Hockey may be more than in other years. There's the possibility of getting 2 teams in from that league. And the other thing that distinguishes it is all 4 teams have had just outstanding goaltending down the stretch.
And you mentioned 2 teams, and, I am in the camp that AIC is a lock regardless of what happens this weekend. And what concerns me about that is the fact that they didn't play a game in February. They haven't played a game yet in March. It has been since the last week of January that they were in competitive gameplay, and they're facing a Niagara team that's led by Jason Lammers, who, for what he's done at Niagara, obviously getting to this stage this season, that's great. But he was, a real key part of those UMass Lowell teams back in the, early 2010s that got to NCAA tournaments, to the Frozen Four, won Hockey East Championship. So that's a big concern for me. And, the other game, Canisius Army, I think that's more of a toss-up. But, you've got a highly favored AIC team that is in a precarious position because they haven't played in so long.
What I want to kind of point to with AIC in particular is that just from the experience that I saw in the last couple of weeks here in closer to where I cover things in the Big Ten, Penn State didn't play for the entire month of February. They had COVID issues. There were some COVID issues on other teams that canceled before. And so they were off that whole month. They came back for the last week of the regular season and played at Notre Dame and lost a couple of games. Then they come into the first round or into the Big Ten quarterfinals and beat Notre Dame and look an awful lot better. So I really do wonder whether it's going to take a little bit more time for AIC to get going. Like you mentioned, that just from that experience that I saw with Penn State, it's not very easy to just get back in the game speed. You can simulate all that you want in practice, but when you actually get going, get on the ice, and with a lot on the line, like in a tournament semifinal, man, that's a lot to expect out of players that haven't skated at that speed and in that intensity for over a month.
And in these single elimination games, goaltending is such a big part of it. I mentioned Chad Veltri of Niagara. Jacob Barczewski at Canisius has been terrific. Trevin Kozlowski at Army all season long has been really good. There are 2 or 3 goaltenders that could see action for AIC. The senior Stefano Durante has been solid too. How huge is a goaltender in one of these single elimination games?
Massive. And we see it go both ways. We just saw it yesterday at Boston College. Was not a goaltender's day. And you have a phenomenal goaltender, possibly the prohibitive favorite to win, at least, he was the Hockey's Player of the Year in Spencer Knight, but, got a good chance at the Richter Award. He probably gets into the Hobie hat trick possibly as well. And he didn't have a good day. And suddenly Boston College, the number 1 team in the nation, is out of the Hockey East tournament. So, yes, goaltenders can steal games, but if goaltenders don't have their stuff in some of these games, you see that as well, because I do feel like players are geared up to play offense for some reason in the postseason. And this year, we've seen a lot of goals. I don't think there's been a single 1-0 shutout thus far in the postseason, and very few 2-1 games. So I feel like offense particularly this season, seem a little bit more cranked up. So if you have a goaltender that's on, it's a big advantage. But if you have a goaltender who just is not having a good day, one and done scenario, boy, that's dangerous.
And that's an awful lot of pressure to put on someone when you know that you're in a one and done. It does kind of put a little more into that goalie's mind going into the game when there's so much expected of you. And we've seen it work for the best in some respects in for a lot of goalies, and we've seen it, make them crumble in sometimes too. So you think that maybe a more veteran goalie would handle that a little bit better, possibly, but you just never know going into those one game situations.
That's going to be the same format in the WCHA. We'll look at that and the Hockey East Finals when the Game of the Week podcast continues.
This is the USCHO Game of the Week podcast from US College Hockey Online.
This is the Game of the Week podcast from USCHO.com. Let's take a look at the WCHA. This one is also intriguing for the NCAA picture because you could talk 2 or 3 teams from the WCHA, probably at least 2. We do have a couple of matchups in the WCHA on Friday. Bemidji State takes on Lake Superior, number 13 Bemidji, number 17 Lake State. And Northern Michigan is at the host of the tournament, number 3 Minnesota State. Minnesota State probably already, undoubtedly already a lock for the WCHA tournament. What do these matchups look like and what are the implications from them?
Well, I like Bemidji State as a lock as well. I have them in my top 12 right now. Lake Superior, I think, can help themselves even with just a semifinal win. I don't know that they have to get to the final. They are one of those teams, though, that I kind of put in that bubble where they're on the good side right now, but you get a few upsets this weekend, particularly like Northern Michigan winning here, UMass Lowell winning in hockeys, Colgate winning, or St. Lawrence winning in the ECAC. Those types of upsets, potentially give you a situation where if you're right on the bubble, you could be knocked out. And I think that Lake Superior is probably the most at peril of the bubble teams in my mind right now. So they want to get through Friday. They need to probably get through Bemidji State here. And then who knows that they're taking on Minnesota State. I mean, you feel like Minnesota State is such a favorite, but Northern Michigan, they showed very well against Bowling Green last weekend. And for some reason, it might not have been the best season in Northern Michigan, but they're playing good hockey right now.
That Bemidji State Lake State game to me is a really it brings up something that hasn't really had much implications before, in that how you look in winning a game does matter this year. I mean, in years past when it's just the pairwise, you could win a game 7-0, you can win a game 1-0, and they count the exact same. I really do think there's some element of style points that's going to be factored in with the committee members this year. Well, if Bemidji State comes up with a really convincing victory against Lake State, I think that makes them even stronger being in there if they don't win the championship game. So that's one of those things to me that really does matter this year more than it ever has before.
And to follow up on that too, Todd, it used to be that it didn't matter when you won games and lost games. You lose them at the beginning of the year, it was the same loss as a loss at the end of the year. But with the subjectivity that is being placed on this year's tournament, you lose a game at the wrong time in the season and the committee can punish you. And that, it's going to be very hard to take that human element out of, but did you see how they performed in their conference tournament? That's one of those questions that keeps going through my mind, and just as you talk about a 7-0 versus a 1-0 win, an early season loss versus a very late season loss probably don't have the same implications as they did in past years either.
Well, let's move on to the final matchup of the weekend, and that's the first ever championship in Hockey East played between the 2 Massachusetts state schools. UMass Lowell will take on number 6 UMass, #flagship. UMass Lowell came back from a 3-0 deficit to down Boston College in the second overtime. UMass had a relatively easier time against Providence. What's the outlook for these 2 teams on Saturday and maybe some of the implications that came out of Wednesday's games?
Well, I'll double down on the UMass Lowell comeback. 3-0, 4-1 late in the third, and then after giving up the go-ahead goal with about 3 minutes left, over 2 minutes left, they still were able to find a way to get that game to overtime, back and tied. And I loved Lowell's heart in that one. I've always said that Norm Bazin gets his team to play good hockey in the right days of the year, usually quarterfinals, semifinals, and finals. And here Lowell is now. This is 6 out of the last 8 Hockey East finals they've been a participant. Of course, they've won 3. They're looking for their 4th in 8 tournaments. Of course, there was no tournament last year. But then you have UMass on the other side of the equation, where this could be, kind of that watershed moment. They've done good things. They got to a national title game, but this is only their 2nd time ever in the Hockey East finals. I think that 2019 still stings a little bit for the players that are back from that team, because they were, the heavy favorite in that tournament, and then got knocked out by BC, who was a number 7 seed in the semifinals. And that motivated their team. I think that, Greg Carville has talked about what has motivated his team this year, and he pointed to a late season tie against Maine. But this is a team that's hungry, and they're going to be on home ice. The bigger sheet that is going to help them a little bit as well. But I really do think that this is a battle. These are two teams that maybe don't have the BC, BU, Michigan State, type of dislike for one another, but I still think there's some dislike, and there is a good rivalry between these two clubs.
There's a good rivalry between the fans, too. We know that for sure. But I want to double down on your doubling down. Not only was Lowell down 4-1 midway through the third and 5-4 in the last couple of minutes, it looked like they were done in the first overtime, and BC had a goal taken off the board in overtime after they had celebrated everything. So to go through that roller coaster, you can't question the heart of those UMass Lowell players, because that's a lot to go through, and to be able to come through and win it. Take that into the championship game. They've got to be just on an incredible high right now. And everything you said about UMass is dead on too. So, that's just a great matchup, at least going in on paper from what it looks like from the outside.
Just one follow-up on UMass Lowell. They did a clamp-down defensive game against BU to move on to this game against BC, and then they just put a ton of shots on net against the Eagles. Which Lowell team is going to play against UMass, or is it a case of they'll use whatever arrow is in their quiver that they need to? I think it's what you just kind of referenced. Use whatever you have to do. If they feel themselves, and UMass is a very good defensive team. I called that game last night against Providence, and Providence bounced back from an early goal and took a 2-1 lead. But then from there, UMass really clamped down their defense. They know how to shut down. They have 4 elite defensemen back there on the blue line, and I think that Lowell is going to have to find a way to penetrate and really take away the eyes of Philly Lindbergh. I don't think you can count on just sniping shots past him. He's a very good goaltender, and I compare him to Spencer Knight in terms of his talent level. He's just as talented. But I think that if Lowell has to play a 1-0 or 2-1 game, they'll do fine. But if they have to play a 5-4 or a 6-5 double overtime game again, they're happy to play whatever. Listen, they're just happy to be playing. They had to go through all 4 rounds of this Hockey East tournament and still need to get a win if they're going to keep their season going. So I think that they're really feeling like they're playing with the house's money at this point. Well, I want to hit on 2 quick points before we wrap up. First, we talked a little bit about criteria. And I think what is going to happen in this, besides the criteria the committee is going to use, which are components of the pairwise and maybe pairwise and RPI within leagues, they're going to have a so-called eye test. And I think the eye test in part is going to be made up of criteria that are not listed. How they did down the stretch. As Todd was mentioning, is it a 7-0 versus a 1-0 game? Some things like that. What kind of things do you think the committee is going to be looking for along the lines of the non-published criteria and the subjective eye test? Well, I really do think that how you performed in your conference tournament is going to start to matter, and it's not supposed to. There used to be a criteria, record in your last 20. I think that was taken down to record in your last 16 at one point. That's been totally eliminated. But in a year like this, it's not intentionally being put in, but I guarantee that there's going to be, so listen, here's your hypothetical. AIC goes out and lays an egg tomorrow night and they lose 5-1. You're going to have
at least 4 conferences around the country, well, maybe I'll say 3. You'll have at least 3 conferences saying, oh, come on, this Atlantic Hockey Conference isn't for real. There's no way you can give AIC a bid into the tournament. I personally disagree with that. I think that they've done what they have to do in the way that things have been laid out. They've got a great winning percentage. They've done well within their league. They're the top-rated team within the pairwise in Atlantic hockey. So I think they deserve to be in. But could I see, a bunch of people on that committee, coaches and administrators alike, saying, you can't put 2 teams in from Atlantic hockey because, AIC has a bad performance? Of course I can.
The thing that stands out to me as one of the unexplained questions or unanswered questions going into this with the committee is, will they factor in how teams did when they were, shorthanded or, really hit by COVID? There were some teams that had to play through shortages of players. A lot of those games just got postponed or canceled, but there were some times when I think, just because it's the team I cover, Wisconsin played 4 games without 4 forwards. Plus also they didn't have Dylan Holloway, who was at the Canadian World Junior Camp. They went 1-3 in those games. I don't know if that, factors in at all. I mean, we know that overtime games get treated a little bit differently. I wonder whether so-called COVID shortage games might get treated a little bit differently. I suspect not, just because there's such a, there's already so many games to factor in that I don't know if you go into that detail. But it's one of those things that I think they've left the door open to consider, because they have talked about, we'll weigh the relative comparative strength of teams as they are right now. If there are teams that have lost players, you have to consider that. So I think there's some possibility they could get into that. I don't know if we'll ever get a great answer on that from them either, on whether they treated any of that differently. But it's one of those things you do have to keep in mind this year.
The other thing that I think is going to come up is a balance, or the question of balance, between Western leagues and Eastern leagues. I think you probably are going to see a 10-6 or maybe 9-7 split, depending on some upsets, with the higher number of the Western leagues. Right now, we pretty much think NCHC gets 4, Hockey East gets 4, Big Ten gets 3. You'll have the Atlantic Hockey winner or AIC in there, and you'll have Minnesota State in there. That right there puts us at 13 teams. There's not a lot of wiggle room. But the thing that I pointed out earlier in the week on our podcast is, if you do have a 10-6 split, that's not unreasonable when you think about the Ivies being out, and probably 2 teams that would have been in that mix from ECAC in Harvard and Cornell, and possibly another Ivy or maybe Union or RPI possibly. But the regional balance will be out the window. So you may have some arguing from the East for some of these teams, but there's not going to be a lot of room to put teams in. We're going to have room for maybe 3 or 4 teams, or maybe down to 1 team if there are enough upsets. And I guess where I'm going with this is, how hard or how easy is the job going to be for the committee when they look at all that?
Well, I think that really factors into how you're going to make teams travel in a pandemic. That is a question that I've heard posed a number of times, is, are you trying to keep teams close? And the answer is usually yes. Now, the regional setup this year isn't going to help, but you've got 10 Western teams. High likelihood, I think, you're at least putting 2 out in the East. And as I was kind of going through bracketology, which will run later today on USCHO, I was noticing the fact that Boston College is in the top band, and it's a possibility that you could have 2 Hockey East teams in the lower band. So if you're trying to stay consistent within band to band, as Mike Kemp told us they would try to do, then you're going to have to send one of your Eastern teams west just to keep them from playing Boston College in the opening round. So could you have 2 East regionals in Albany and Bridgeport, where you only have 5 Eastern teams and you have 3 Western teams? It could be a lot of air travel that I think that the NCAA had hoped to avoid. There's going to be a lot of charter flights, but the reality is that that's what we might be looking at. And that could be part of the really difficult task, not just selecting this field, but how do you seed it once you do?
Yeah, absolutely. You get into the minutia of just thinking about some of the teams in the Big Ten, because that's who I've thought about. Wisconsin is going to be a flight wherever they go. Minnesota would be a flight everywhere except Fargo, but they're not going to go to Fargo because North Dakota is going to be in Fargo, and they're going to be a 1 seed as far as we all know. And so you get into those little things. It's like, okay, we're racking up a lot of flights here, but there's some of the ways that there's just not any way of avoiding it because of where the regionals are this year. And it's maybe not the greatest year ever to have a regional in Colorado, but that's where we're at. And because there haven't been a whole lot of interest, obviously, in from other sites around the Midwest lately. But it's one of those things where I think they're going to have to, if they can limit it, great. But travel is going to be travel. It's not a great situation, but have to do what you have to do in this to, I think. And I hope that integrity of the bracket does remain one of the major, key points of what they're trying to do there.
Well, for the first time in years, it's going to be a lot of suspense on Sunday night at 7:00 Eastern when the field is announced on ESPNU. And we'll keep you updated on all of that at USCHO.com. Thanks, Todd, for joining us on this episode. And for Jim Connelly, I'm Ed Trefzger, and we'll catch you next time.
This has been the USCHO Game of the Week podcast, a production of US College Hockey Online. Visit USCHO.com/podcasts to listen or subscribe.